never imagined my perfect wedding day would end with men in black suits surrounding the altar, speaking into their earpieces, and my mother's jaw dropping to the marble floor of St. Catherine's Cathedral. The look of absolute shock on her face as she realized everything she thought she knew about the man I was marrying was completely wrong will be burned into my memory forever. But it was what happened next, the words that came out of my groom's mouth when those agents stepped forward, that truly left everyone speechless. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning had started exactly as I dreamed it would at the Grandview Manor, an elegant estate nestled in the rolling hills of Charlottesville, Virginia. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the bridal suite, casting everything in a golden glow that made the ivory silk of my grandmother's wedding dress shimmer like liquid pearl. My best friend Madison was carefully adjusting the cathedral-length veil that had belonged to 3 generations of women in my family, while my cousin Rebecca arranged the bouquet of white roses and baby's breath that we'd spent months perfecting. The air was thick with excitement and the faint scent of gardenias from the arrangements that filled every corner of the historic venue. I was Kennedy Stewart, and at 28, I thought I had everything figured out. My marketing degree from the University of Virginia had led to a successful career managing social media campaigns for several high-end boutiques in Richmond. I lived in a charming townhouse in the Fan District, drove a reliable Honda Civic, and had been saving every penny for this wedding for the past 2 years. Everything about my life was carefully planned, methodically organized, and refreshingly normal. At least that's what I believed as I stood there in my grandmother's dress, preparing to marry the man who had quietly and completely captured my heart 18 months ago. James Mitchell had entered my life in the most ordinary way possible. We met at a coffee shop called Been There Done That, where I was working on a campaign for a local jewelry store, and he was reading what looked like government documents while nursing a black coffee that had long since gone cold. When I accidentally bumped his table while reaching for a napkin, sending his papers scattering across the floor, he'd laughed it off with such genuine warmth that I found myself apologizing for 10 minutes straight. "Really, it's fine," he'd said, gathering up the scattered documents with quick, efficient movements. I was getting tired of reading anyway. Government paperwork isn't exactly thrilling bedtime material. That comment had sparked our first conversation about his job as what he described as a mid-level analyst for a federal agency. He was deliberately vague about the specifics, explaining that government work involved a lot of bureaucracy and confidential information that wasn't particularly interesting to discuss. I'd assumed he worked for something like the Department of Agriculture or maybe the Social Security Administration, the kind of steady, unglamorous federal position that provided good benefits and job security, but not much excitement. James was medium height with dark brown hair that was always perfectly styled, green eyes that seemed to notice everything, and a quiet confidence that drew people to him without him having to say much. He had the kind of presence that made servers remember his order, made elderly ladies smile when he held doors, and made children wave at him from their strollers. There was something undeniably appealing about his calm steadiness in a world that often felt chaotic. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally. He took me to small restaurants tucked away in Richmond's side streets, places with incredible food and zero pretension. We spent evenings walking through Maymont Park, talking about everything and nothing. He was an excellent listener, asking thoughtful questions about my work and my dreams, but always steering conversations away from his own professional life. "Work is work," he'd say with a smile whenever I pressed for details. "I'd rather hear about this campaign you're developing. Tell me more about how you convinced that restaurant to try Instagram stories instead of traditional print ads." He seemed genuinely fascinated by my marketing strategies, asking detailed questions about target demographics and brand positioning that made me feel like my work actually mattered. In a world where most people's eyes glazed over when I mentioned conversion rates and engagement metrics, James made me feel like a creative genius. The proposal had been perfectly him, understanded, thoughtful, and completely unexpected. We were having dinner at a tiny Italian restaurant in Churchill when he casually mentioned that he'd been thinking about our future. Before I knew it, he was on one knee beside our table, presenting a simple but beautiful solitaire diamond ring and asking if I'd like to spend the rest of my life having conversations like this one. I said yes before he'd even finished the question. The engagement had been blissfully uncomplicated. James let me handle all the wedding planning while he managed what he vaguely described as some work obligations that require travel. He was often away for days at a time, returning with stories about boring conferences in Washington or training seminars that he couldn't discuss in detail due to government confidentiality requirements. I didn't question it because James's absences gave me complete creative control over our wedding, and I threw myself into the planning with the same methodical precision I brought to my marketing campaigns. Every detail was researched, every vendor vetted, every timeline optimized for maximum efficiency and impact. My mother, Patricia Stewart, had other ideas about what constituted appropriate wedding planning. "Kennedy, darling," she'd said during one of our many heated phone conversations about the guest list, "I just think you should consider whether this young man is really the right fit for our family's social position." My mother had never been subtle about her concerns regarding James. As the wife of Dr. Richard Stewart, Richmond's most prominent cardiovascular surgeon, she moved in circles where success was measured by the size of one's house in the West End, the exclusivity of one's country club membership, and the prestige of one's children's accomplishments. James, with his government salary and his reluctance to discuss career advancement opportunities, did not meet her standards for an appropriate son-in-law. "He seems nice enough," she'd continue, "but nice doesn't pay for private school tuition or country club memberships. You're settling, Kennedy. You could do so much better." These conversations always ended the same way, with me defending James's character and my mother sighing dramatically about my romantic naivety. She'd eventually change the subject to some detail about the wedding reception, but her disapproval hung over every planning session like a cloud threatening rain. My father, thankfully, had been more welcoming. Dr. Stewart appreciated James's quiet intelligence and his obvious devotion to me, even if he sometimes seemed puzzled by James's evasive answers about his career trajectory. "Government work can be very rewarding," Dad had said diplomatically after one particularly awkward family dinner, though I admit I'm not entirely clear on what agency he works for or what his advancement opportunities might be. The morning of the wedding, as Madison finished the final touches on my makeup and Rebecca went to check on the flower arrangements, my mother made her entrance into the bridal suite with the dramatic flair she'd perfected over years of charitable fundraising events. Patricia Stewart was an elegant woman who understood the power of presentation. Her silver hair was styled in a sophisticated chignon, her navy blue mother-of-the-bride dress was perfectly tailored, and her jewelry had been selected to complement without competing with my bridal ensemble. She looked every inch the society matron she'd worked for 30 years to become. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," she said, kissing my cheek carefully to avoid disturbing my makeup. "Absolutely radiant. Your grandmother would be so proud to see you wearing her dress." But I could see the reservation in her eyes, the same doubt that had colored every conversation about James for the past year and a half. "Mom," I said quietly, taking her hands in mine, "I need you to be happy for me today. James is a good man who loves me completely, and I love him the same way. That's what matters." She squeezed my hands and managed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, darling. I just want you to have everything you deserve." What I deserved, in her mind, was someone with a more impressive career, a larger bank account, and the kind of social connections that would elevate our family's status in Richmond's competitive hierarchy. James, with his modest government job and his reluctance to network at the country club, represented everything she feared about my settling for less than my potential. As we prepared to leave for the ceremony, I caught a glimpse of myself in the full-length mirror that had been brought in specifically for the bridal suite. The woman looking back at me was everything I dreamed of being on my wedding day, elegant, confident, and completely in love. In a few hours, I would be Mrs. James Mitchell, married to a man who made me laugh, supported my ambitions, and treated me like I was the most important person in his world. My mother's concerns about social status and career advancement seemed insignificant compared to the certainty I felt about spending my life with someone who valued me for who I was rather than what I could contribute to his image. Little did I know that everything I thought I understood about James, about our relationship, and about the quiet government analyst I was about to marry was about to change in the most dramatic and public way possible. The limousine that would take us to St. Catherine's Cathedral was waiting outside, and the photographer was already capturing candid moments of our pre-ceremony preparations. In less than an hour, I would be walking down the aisle toward the man I loved, surrounded by family and friends who had come to celebrate our beginning. None of us had any idea that this wedding was about to become something none of us would ever forget. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The Gothic spires of St. Catherine's Cathedral pierced the cloudless October sky as our wedding party arrived in a convoy of pristine white limousines. The historic church, built in 1889, had hosted countless Richmond society weddings over the decades, and its soaring stained glass windows and hand-carved wooden pews provided exactly the kind of elegant backdrop my mother deemed appropriate for what she still considered my misguided but expensive mistake. As I stepped out of the limousine, the weight of my grandmother's silk train rustling against the stone steps, I noticed something that seemed slightly odd but not alarming. There were more black sedans parked along Monument Avenue than seemed necessary for a wedding of our size. Professional-looking men in dark suits stood at various points around the cathedral's perimeter, their positions too strategic to be coincidental. "Lots of security for a weekend wedding," Madison murmured, adjusting my veil as we climbed the cathedral steps. "There must be another event happening nearby." I nodded absently, my attention focused on the beautiful music drifting from inside the church and the excited faces of our guests visible through the massive oak doors. James was somewhere beyond those doors, probably making last-minute small talk with our officiant, Reverend Thomas Harper, who had known my family for 20 years. The photographer, an energetic woman named Sarah Chen, whom I'd hired based on her portfolio of elegant Richmond weddings, was already positioned to capture our entrance. Her assistant moved through the gathering crowd with practiced efficiency, adjusting light reflectors and checking camera angles. "Mrs. Stewart," Sarah called out, addressing my mother with the respectful formality that had secured her this job. "Would you like some photos of the family before we begin the processional?" My mother nodded, her professional event planning instincts taking over, despite her reservations about the groom. She gathered my father, my younger brother Michael, who was home from law school at Washington and Lee, and my paternal grandparents, who had driven down from Alexandria for the ceremony. As Sarah arranged us for formal portraits, I caught sight of more men in suits positioning themselves around the cathedral entrance. They moved with military precision, speaking occasionally into what looked like communications devices. One of them made brief eye contact with me and nodded politely before returning his attention to scanning the crowd. "Kennedy," my father said, approaching with the kind of gentle concern that had made him such a beloved physician, "have you noticed the unusual security presence here today?" I had noticed, but I'd attributed it to some kind of city event or perhaps another wedding party that had requested additional protection. Richmond's Monument Avenue hosted multiple events every weekend, and it wasn't unusual for various functions to overlap. "Maybe there's a political fundraiser at the Jefferson Hotel," I suggested, referring to the historic luxury hotel just a few blocks away. "You know how those events always come with extra security." Dad nodded, though he looked unconvinced. "Perhaps. It just seems like quite a lot for a Saturday afternoon." Reverend Harper emerged from the cathedral's main entrance, his kind face beaming with the joy he brought to every wedding ceremony he performed. He'd baptized me as an infant, confirmed me as a teenager, and now he was going to marry me to the man I loved. The continuity felt deeply meaningful. "Kennedy, my dear," he said, taking my hands in his warm grasp, "you look absolutely beautiful. Your grandmother would be so proud to see you wearing her dress in this sacred space." "Thank you, Reverend Harper. Is James ready?" "Oh, yes, he's been ready for an hour," the Reverend chuckled. "I've never seen a groom quite so calm and composed. He's handling the pre-ceremony nerves better than most men I've married." This sounded exactly like James. While I'd been a bundle of excited energy all morning, checking and rechecking every detail, he'd probably spent the time reading or making quiet conversation with the groomsmen. His steady, unflappable nature was one of the things I loved most about him. "There is one small matter," Reverend Harper continued, lowering his voice slightly. "Some gentlemen arrived about 30 minutes ago, asking questions about the ceremony. They showed credentials and asked to speak with James privately. Everything seemed quite official, but it was unusual." A flutter of unease moved through my chest. "What kind of questions?" "Oh, nothing concerning. They seemed to be confirming details about the guest list and the reception venue. Security protocol, they said. James spoke with them briefly and everything was resolved." Security protocol for what? James works as a government analyst, but surely that doesn't require security screenings for our wedding guests, unless there was something about his work that he hadn't explained in detail. Madison appeared at my elbow, checking her phone. "Kennedy, the string quartet is ready to begin the processional music. Everyone's in position." I took a deep breath, trying to center myself in this moment I'd been anticipating for months. Whatever questions I had about the security presence could wait until after the ceremony. Nothing was going to diminish the joy of marrying James. The cathedral's massive doors opened fully, revealing the breathtaking interior that had been transformed into a garden of white roses, eucalyptus, and cascading ivy. Hundreds of white candles flickered in wall sconces and window alcoves, casting everything in warm, romantic light. The pews were filled with the faces of everyone who mattered most in our lives. As the opening notes of Pachelbel's canon began to float through the cathedral's soaring space, I saw James for the first time that day. He stood at the altar in his perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression serious but peaceful. When his eyes met mine across the length of the cathedral, his face broke into the kind of smile that had made me fall in love with him in that coffee shop 18 months ago. He looked exactly like the man I'd been dreaming of marrying, handsome, confident, and completely focused on me. But as I began walking down the aisle on my father's arm, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about him today. There was an alertness in his posture, a heightened awareness that seemed at odds with his usual relaxed demeanor. My mother, seated in the front pew, wearing an expression of resigned acceptance, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Despite her reservations about James's career prospects, she was genuinely moved by the ceremony's beauty and the obvious love between her daughter and the man she was about to marry. The processional felt both eternal and instantaneous. I was aware of every detail: the way the candlelight caught the stained glass, the soft rustling of silk and organza from the bridesmaids' dresses, the gentle pressure of my father's arm as he guided me toward my future. But I was also intensely focused on James, whose steady gaze never left mine during the entire walk down the aisle. When we reached the altar, my father lifted my veil and kissed my cheek with the tenderness he'd shown me since childhood. "Be happy, sweetheart," he whispered, before placing my hand in James's and taking his seat beside my mother. James's hand was warm and strong, exactly as familiar as it had been every day for the past year and a half. But as Reverend Harper began the opening words of the ceremony, I noticed something I'd never seen before. James was wearing what looked like a small communications device in his ear, nearly invisible but unmistakably there. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Harper began, his voice carrying easily through the cathedral's acoustics, "we are gathered here today to witness and celebrate the union of Kennedy Grace Stewart and James Mitchell in holy matrimony." I tried to focus on the Reverend's words, on the significance of the vows we were about to exchange, but my attention kept drifting to that tiny device in James's ear. Why would he be wearing a communications earpiece at our wedding? As if sensing my distraction, James squeezed my hand gently and leaned slightly closer. "Everything's fine," he murmured, so quietly that only I could hear. I'll explain later. But everything didn't feel fine. As I looked past James toward the packed pews, I began noticing details that had escaped my attention during the processional. Several men in dark suits were seated throughout the congregation, their positions scattered but strategic. They weren't talking or smiling like typical wedding guests. Instead, they seemed to be monitoring the ceremony with professional attention. My college roommate Jessica, seated in the third row, caught my eye and made a subtle gesture toward one of these men. Her expression was puzzled, clearly wondering the same thing I was beginning to wonder. Who were these people, and why were they at my wedding? James followed my gaze and seemed to read my thoughts. "Kennedy," he said softly, "I need you to trust me for just a few more minutes. Then everything will make sense." Reverend Harper continued with the ceremony, asking the congregation to affirm their support for our marriage and beginning the exchange of vows we'd written ourselves. But the mysterious presence of so many serious-looking strangers was making it impossible for me to fully engage with what should have been the most meaningful moment of my life. Then, just as James began reciting the vows we'd spent weeks perfecting, something happened that changed everything. A man in a black suit approached the altar from the side of the cathedral, moving with quiet authority but obvious urgency. He positioned himself just close enough to speak to James without disrupting the ceremony, and I watched my future husband's expression shift from loving bridegroom to something I'd never seen before: complete professional focus. The man whispered something in James's ear. James nodded once, then turned to Reverend Harper. "Reverend," James said, his voice carrying a tone of calm authority that seemed to transform his entire presence, "I need to pause the ceremony for just one moment." The cathedral fell silent, except for the soft crackling of candle flames. 300 guests shifted in their pews, sensing that something unprecedented was about to happen. That's when I heard the sound that would change everything I thought I knew about the man I was marrying: the distinctive static of multiple radio communications activating simultaneously throughout the cathedral. The silence that followed James's request to pause the ceremony was so complete that the sound of my grandmother's pearls clicking against each other as I trembled seemed to echo through the cathedral's vaulted ceiling. 300 wedding guests held their collective breath as the man in the black suit stepped forward, no longer making any attempt to remain inconspicuous. "Ladies and gentlemen," James said, his voice carrying a natural command that I had never heard before, not once in 18 months of conversations about everything from coffee preferences to our dreams for the future. "I apologize for the interruption, but there's something I need to share with all of you." He turned to face me fully, and I saw a transformation that was so complete it was as if I was looking at a stranger wearing my fiancé's face. The quiet government analyst who read boring paperwork in coffee shops had been replaced by someone who commanded attention without raising his voice, who seemed to fill the space around him with an authority that made everyone lean forward to listen. "Kennedy," he said, taking my hands in both of his, "everything I've told you about loving you is absolutely true. Everything I've said about wanting to spend my life with you is completely honest. But there are things about my work, about who I am professionally, that I haven't been able to share until now." The communications devices throughout the cathedral crackled to life again, and I watched as more men in dark suits emerged from positions I hadn't even realized they'd been occupying. They weren't guests at all. They had been stationed throughout the cathedral like a protective perimeter, and now they were making their presence known. My mother's face had gone completely white. She gripped my father's arm with enough force to leave marks, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide her shock as she began to understand that her concerns about James's career prospects had been based on fundamentally incorrect information. "James," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself, "what's happening?" Instead of answering immediately, he nodded to the man who had approached the altar. The man stepped forward and addressed our wedding guests with the kind of professional authority that made it clear this wasn't a request for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Agent Thompson with the United States Secret Service. For security reasons, I need everyone to remain in their seats while we complete a brief protocol. Secret Service. The words hit the cathedral like a physical force, causing an immediate ripple of whispered conversations and shocked gasps. Secret Service agents protected current and former presidents, vice presidents, their families, and certain other high-level government officials. They didn't provide security for mid-level government analysts. Unless the person they were protecting wasn't a mid-level government analyst at all. James reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small leather credential case. He opened it and held it where I could see an official government identification that made my knees go weak. The ID bore James's photograph, but the name wasn't James Mitchell. It read James Alexander Harrison, and underneath, in official government formatting, United States Secret Service, Presidential Protection Division. "My real name is James Alexander Harrison," he said, his voice gentle but clear enough for the front rows to hear. "For the past 3 years, I've been working as a Secret Service agent assigned to Presidential Protection Detail. The reason I've been vague about my work is because operational security requires it." The cathedral erupted in muffled conversations as guests tried to process what they were hearing. My college friend Jessica was staring with her mouth open. My brother Michael, the law student, looked like he was trying to remember everything he'd ever learned about federal law enforcement protocols. But it was my mother's reaction that captured my attention most completely. Patricia Stewart, the woman who had spent months worrying that I was marrying beneath my social station, was gripping the pew in front of her like she might faint. Her concerns about James's career prospects and earning potential had just been obliterated in the most public way imaginable. "Kennedy," James continued, his professional composure softening as he focused entirely on me, "I couldn't tell you the truth about my job because of security clearance requirements. Secret Service agents' identities are protected information, especially those of us who work direct presidential protection." Agent Thompson stepped closer, addressing the congregation again. "The reason for today's security presence is that Agent Harrison's cover identity is being retired following his engagement to Mrs. Stewart. Protocol requires a security briefing for immediate family members and a controlled revelation of his actual position." I stared at James, at Agent Harrison, trying to reconcile this information with the man who had worried about whether his government salary was sufficient to afford the kind of engagement ring he thought I deserved. The man who had been embarrassed when my mother asked pointed questions about his advancement opportunities. "The conferences you traveled to?" I said, my mind racing through 18 months of conversations. "The training seminars you couldn't discuss." "Presidential protection assignments," he confirmed. "When I was away, I was working security for official presidential travel or training at our facilities in Maryland." The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. The physical fitness that I'd attributed to his enjoyment of running, the way he unconsciously scanned every room we entered, his habit of positioning himself between me and doorways or crowds, the careful way he asked questions about my friends and family, which I'd interpreted as romantic interest, but now realized had been a security assessment. "The reason you never wanted me to post photos of us on social media?" I said, my voice growing stronger as understanding dawned. "Operational security," he nodded. "Secret Service agents maintain low public profiles to protect the effectiveness of our assignments." My father, the cardiovascular surgeon who prided himself on remaining calm under pressure, was shaking his head slowly. "Son," he said, addressing James with a respect that hadn't been there during our previous family dinners, "are you telling us that you've been protecting the President of the United States?" "Among other protectees, yes, sir," James replied. "I've been in presidential detail for the past 18 months, which coincides exactly with when Kennedy and I met." Agent Thompson stepped forward again. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're witnessing today is an unusual but not unprecedented situation. When Secret Service agents marry, their spouses and immediate family members receive security briefings and are read into certain aspects of their operational requirements. This was why there were so many agents positioned throughout the cathedral. This wasn't just a wedding, it was an official government security operation designed to safely transition James from covert to acknowledged status within our family and social circle. My mother finally found her voice. "Kennedy," she called out from the front pew, her tone completely different from any conversation we'd had about James over the past year. "Did you have any idea?" I shook my head, still holding James's hands, still trying to process the magnitude of what had been hidden from me. None. I thought he analyzed agricultural reports or processed Social Security claims. A ripple of laughter moved through the congregation at this admission. The idea that I had been dating one of the most elite law enforcement officers in the country while assuming he pushed papers in a boring government office was absurd enough to cut through the tension. James squeezed my hands gently. "Kennedy, I need you to understand that everything about our relationship has been real. My feelings for you, my desire to marry you, my excitement about building a life together, none of that was part of any assignment or cover story." But the identity? James Mitchell was a cover identity that allowed me to have a normal personal life while maintaining operational security. James Harrison is who I really am, and he loves you just as completely as James Mitchell did. Agent Thompson addressed the congregation once more. "For security reasons, we need to ask that no one discusses Agent Harrison's actual position or posts about today's events on social media until we've completed our security protocols. Everyone here will be contacted within the next week for a brief security briefing." The magnitude of what was happening began to settle over me. I wasn't just marrying a man who had been less than truthful about his job. I was marrying a federal agent whose work put him in the direct line of fire to protect the highest levels of the American government. "James," I said, using his real name for the first time, "when you're working presidential protection, are you in danger?" His expression grew serious. "There are risks involved in the job, yes, but I'm extensively trained and I work with the best team in federal law enforcement." The reality of what this meant for our marriage, for our future children, for the life I thought we were going to build together crashed over me like a wave. This wasn't just about discovering that my fiancé had a more impressive job than I'd realized. This was about learning that the man I loved put his life on the line to protect others, and that our life together would forever be shaped by security requirements I was only beginning to understand. Reverend Harper, who had been standing in stunned silence throughout this entire revelation, finally stepped forward. "Well," he said, with the kind of gentle humor that had endeared him to our family for decades, "this is certainly the most interesting wedding ceremony I've ever performed." The congregation laughed again, and I felt some of the tension in my chest begin to ease. Whatever else was true, James was still the man who made me laugh, who listened to my dreams, who had proposed to me in a tiny Italian restaurant because he wanted to spend his life having conversations with me. "Kennedy," he said softly, his green eyes serious and hopeful, "knowing everything you now know, will you still marry me?" I looked out at our wedding guests, many of whom were still processing the revelation that they were attending the wedding of a Secret Service agent. I looked at my mother, whose entire worldview about my choice in husband had been completely overturned. I looked at the agents positioned throughout the cathedral, professional guardians who would now be permanent fixtures in our lives. Then I looked back at James Harrison, the man I loved, who had just revealed that everything I thought I knew about him was both completely wrong and completely true at the same time. The weight of James's question hung in the cathedral's incense-scented air like a prayer waiting for an answer. 300 guests sat in absolute silence, watching as I processed the most significant revelation of my life while still holding my bouquet of white roses and wearing my grandmother's silk wedding dress. "Yes," I said, my voice steady and clear enough to reach the back pews. "Yes, I'll still marry you. But we're going to have a very long conversation later about the difference between government confidentiality and outright deception." A collective exhale seemed to rise from the congregation, followed by spontaneous applause that started with my college roommate Jessica and spread through the cathedral like wildfire. Even some of the Secret Service agents positioned throughout the sanctuary allowed small smiles to cross their professional expressions. Reverend Harper, who had performed hundreds of weddings, but never one interrupted by a federal security revelation, cleared his throat and consulted his ceremonial notes. "Well then," he said, with the adaptability that had made him beloved by Richmond families for 3 decades, "shall we continue with the exchange of vows?" I believe we were at the part where the groom was about to promise to love, honor, and cherish his bride. As James, I was going to have to get used to calling him by his real name, began reciting the personal vows we had written together, I found myself listening to familiar words with completely new understanding. When he promised to protect and support me through whatever challenges life might bring, I now realized he was speaking from professional as well as personal experience with protection and crisis management. When he promised to be honest and transparent in our communication, I understood that he was acknowledging the 1.5 years of necessary deception and committing to a different kind of relationship moving forward. My own vows, written weeks ago when I thought I was marrying a modest government analyst, took on deeper meaning as I spoke them. When I promised to stand by him regardless of the demands his career might place on our family, I was now making that commitment with full knowledge of what those demands would actually entail. The ring exchange proceeded with Agent Thompson maintaining his position near the altar, a subtle reminder that this ceremony was now as much an official security operation as it was a romantic celebration. When James placed the platinum wedding band on my finger, I noticed that his own hands, which I had always admired for their steadiness, bore small scars I had never asked about. Now I wondered if they were training injuries or something more serious. "By the power vested in me by the Commonwealth of Virginia," Reverend Harper announced, his voice carrying the joy and authority that made every couple feel that their marriage was a sacred miracle. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. James, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was familiar and new at the same time. It was the same James who had kissed me goodnight 1,000 times before, but it was also the first kiss I had shared with James Harrison, Secret Service agent, the man whose real job involved risking his life to protect others. The recessional music began, but instead of the traditional exit, Agent Thompson stepped forward once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, for security purposes, the wedding party will exit first, followed by immediate family, and then guests will be dismissed by rows. Thank you for your cooperation." As we walked back down the cathedral aisle as husband and wife, I caught glimpses of our guests' faces that ranged from amazed to bewildered to thoroughly entertained. My brother Michael was grinning like he had just witnessed the most fascinating legal proceeding of his law school career. My father looked proud, but concerned, probably running through medical scenarios involving gunshot wounds and trauma care. But it was my mother's expression that captured my attention most completely. Patricia Stewart sat in the front pew with tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, but they weren't tears of disappointment or social embarrassment. For the first time since I had announced my engagement, my mother looked genuinely happy about my choice in husband. Outside the cathedral, the organized chaos of a typical wedding photography session was complicated by the discreet presence of multiple federal agents and what appeared to be additional security vehicles that had arrived during the ceremony. Sarah Chen, our photographer, was gamely attempting to capture romantic portraits while navigating around men with earpieces and tactical equipment. "This is definitely going to be my most unique wedding portfolio," Sarah murmured as she directed James and I toward a patch of late afternoon sunlight filtering through the cathedral's Gothic architecture. "Should I avoid getting the security detail in any of the shots?" James, Agent Harrison, conferred briefly with Agent Thompson before answering. "Actually, Sarah, we're going to need you to sign a confidentiality agreement before you can process any of today's photos. Standard security protocol when federal agents' identities are involved." This was my first real glimpse into how marriage to a Secret Service agent was going to affect even the most ordinary aspects of our life together. Wedding photos, social media posts, family gatherings, everything would now be filtered through security considerations I had never imagined. My mother approached us with the kind of graceful determination she had perfected through years of managing charitable fundraising events and social crises. "James," she said, and I noticed that she used his real name without hesitation, "I owe you an apology." James looked genuinely surprised. Mrs. Stewart, that's not necessary. Oh, it absolutely is necessary, my mother replied firmly. I spent the better part of a year questioning whether you were good enough for my daughter, worried that you lacked ambition and the means to provide for a family properly. She paused, smoothing her navy dress with hands that were trembling slightly. It appears I have been spectacularly wrong about your qualifications. Mom, I said gently, you couldn't have known. That's precisely the point, Kennedy, she replied, turning to address James directly. You allowed me to believe you were underemployed and unambitious, rather than reveal information that could compromise your security clearance. That level of professional dedication and personal sacrifice demonstrates exactly the kind of character I should have been looking for in a son-in-law. Agent Thompson approached our family group with the kind of diplomatic timing that suggested he was accustomed to managing delicate interpersonal situations alongside security protocols. Mrs. Stewart, Dr. Stewart, he said, addressing my parents with formal respect, we'll need to schedule security briefings for immediate family members within the next few days. This will include information about operational security, communication protocols, and emergency procedures. My father, who had been quietly processing everything that had happened during the ceremony, stepped forward with the analytical approach that made him an excellent surgeon. Agent Thompson, can you give us a general overview of what marriage to a Secret Service agent means for our daughter's safety and security? Dr. Stewart, Agent Harrison's position does involve certain security considerations, but spouses of Secret Service agents live normal, fulfilling lives. The agency provides comprehensive support for family members, including security briefings, emergency protocols, and counseling services when needed. Madison and Rebecca, my bridesmaids, had been standing nearby listening to this conversation with the fascinated attention of people witnessing something they had never imagined experiencing. Madison, ever practical, was the first to speak up. Kennedy, does this mean your honeymoon is going to involve federal security clearances? James laughed, and it was the same warm sound that had made me fall in love with him in that coffee shop. Actually, the honeymoon is one of the few times when I'll be completely off duty. No earpiece, no security protocols, just us and a beach in Tuscany. Tuscany? I looked at him with surprise. I thought we were going to that bed and breakfast in Asheville. That was the cover story, he admitted with a slightly embarrassed smile. I've actually planned a 2-week trip to Italy. I figured after everything you were about to learn about my real job, you deserved a honeymoon that was significantly more elaborate than I originally let on. Agent Thompson checked his watch and surveyed the crowd of wedding guests who were slowly being released from the cathedral in organized groups. Agent Harrison, we should move to the reception venue soon. We've already completed the security sweep at Grandview Manor, and the team is in position. The reception. In all the drama of the ceremony's revelations, I had almost forgotten that we still had 3 hours of celebration ahead of us. 300 guests who had just learned that they were attending the wedding of a federal agent, my mother, who was still processing her complete misjudgment of my husband's career prospects, and a reception venue that was now under Secret Service protection. As we climbed into the limousine that would take us to Grandview Manor, I realized that the most challenging part of the day might not have been the ceremony's dramatic revelations. It was going to be navigating a reception full of people who were dying to ask questions about what it was like to be married to someone who protects the President of the United States. James took my hand as the limousine pulled away from the cathedral, and I noticed that he was no longer wearing the nearly invisible communications earpiece. So, I said, settling against his shoulder in the familiar way that had comforted me through 18 months of what I now knew had been a carefully maintained cover identity, Agent Harrison, what else haven't you told me about our life together? He was quiet for a moment, watching Richmond's historic Monument Avenue pass by the limousine windows. Kennedy, there are aspects of my work that I will never be able to discuss, even with you. But I promise you that there are no more secrets about who I am or what our marriage means. What about children? I asked, voicing one of the dozen concerns that had been building in my mind since the ceremony. Carefully, he replied honestly, with additional security considerations and some lifestyle adjustments. But Agent Harrison's children grow up safe, loved, and proud of their father's service to the country. As we approached Grandview Manor, I could see that the elegant estate had been transformed, not just with our wedding decorations, but with a discreet security presence that would now be a permanent part of our lives together. The woman who had woken up this morning expecting to marry a modest government analyst was about to enter her wedding reception as the wife of one of the most elite law enforcement officers in the United States. And somehow, despite everything that had changed in the space of one dramatic ceremony, I had never been more certain that I had married exactly the right man. The reception at Grandview Manor felt like stepping into an alternate universe where everything looked exactly as I had planned it months ago, but the underlying reality had been completely transformed. The ballroom's crystal chandeliers cast their warm light over tables decorated with white roses and silver accents. The string quartet played the elegant classical pieces I had selected, and the champagne fountains sparkled exactly as I had envisioned during countless planning meetings. But now, those same decorations served as the backdrop for what was essentially a federal security operation disguised as a wedding celebration. As James and I were announced as Mr. and Mrs. Harrison for the first time, another adjustment I was still processing, I noticed how Agent Thompson and his team had seamlessly integrated themselves into the reception's atmosphere. They looked like any other formally dressed wedding guests, except for their strategic positioning throughout the ballroom and their shared habit of scanning the room with professional attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," the reception coordinator announced, "please welcome Kennedy and James Harrison for their first dance as husband and wife." The dance floor cleared as the string quartet began playing At Last by Etta James, the song we had chosen months ago when I thought I was marrying a man whose idea of protecting me involved checking my car's tire pressure and insisting on walking on the traffic side of sidewalks. Now I understood that his protective instincts came from professional training in threat assessment and crisis response. As we moved together on the dance floor, James held me with the same gentle confidence he always had, but I was acutely aware that everyone watching us was seeing our relationship through a completely different lens. The quiet government analyst who had seemed almost too modest for my mother's ambitious expectations had been revealed as someone whose job involved protecting the most powerful person in the world. "How are you handling all this?" James asked quietly as we swayed to the familiar music. "I'm processing," I replied honestly. 18 months of thinking I knew exactly who you were, and it turns out I knew almost nothing about your professional life. "But you knew who I was as a person," he said, spinning me gently in the move we had practiced during our dance lessons. "My feelings for you, my values, my sense of humor, my dreams for our future together, all of that was completely real." During the second verse of our song, I caught sight of my mother at the head table. She was in an animated conversation with Agent Thompson, and from her animated gestures and his patient responses, it was clear that she was getting a detailed explanation of exactly what she had been wrong about regarding James's career prospects. When our first dance ended, the traditional father-daughter dance began. As my father walked me onto the floor, he wore the expression of concentrated concern that usually meant he was working through a complex medical problem. "Sweetheart," he said, as we began moving to The Way You Look Tonight, "I need to ask you something important. Are you prepared for what marriage to a federal agent really means?" It was exactly the kind of direct question I had been asking myself since the ceremony ended. "Dad, I don't think I can be prepared until I actually experience it, but I love him, and I'm committed to figuring it out as we go." "It's not just about the security aspects," my father continued, his voice low enough that the surrounding guests couldn't overhear. "It's about the psychological stress of knowing that your husband's job involves putting himself in harm's way to protect others. It's about the classified nature of his work, meaning there will always be parts of his life you can't fully share." I had been thinking about exactly these issues during the limousine ride from the cathedral. "Dad, you've been a cardiovascular surgeon for 30 years. Mom has lived with the knowledge that your work involves life and death decisions every day. How is this different?" He considered this comparison as we continued dancing. "That's a fair point, but when I go to work, I'm trying to save lives. When James goes to work, there are people who might be trying to take his life or the life of the person he's protecting." The weight of this distinction settled over me like a heavy blanket. Marriage to James didn't just mean adjusting to security protocols and confidentiality requirements.
It meant living with the constant awareness that his dedication to protecting others could put him in genuine danger. As the father-daughter dance concluded, James approached to escort me back to the head table. But before we could sit down, Agent Thompson appeared with a subtle hand gesture that clearly meant something in Secret Service communication. "Agent Harrison," he said quietly, "we need to brief Mrs. Harrison on some immediate protocols before the evening continues." This is happening now. In the middle of my wedding reception, I was about to receive my first official security briefing as the spouse of a federal agent.
Agent Thompson guided us to a smaller room adjacent to the main ballroom, where two other agents were waiting with official-looking documents and what appeared to be communication equipment. "Mrs. Harrison," Agent Thompson began, and hearing my new name used in this context made everything feel suddenly intensely real. "Congratulations on your marriage. What we need to discuss now are the immediate security protocols that take effect as of today." He opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several documents. First, your personal security. While Agent Harrison's position doesn't typically require protection for family members, there are certain precautions we recommend, especially during the initial transition period when his cover identity is being retired. James took my hand as Agent Thompson continued. "This includes guidelines for social media use, protocols for discussing Agent Harrison's work with friends and family, and procedures for reporting any unusual contact or suspicious activity." The second agent, who introduced herself as Agent Martinez, handed me a small device that looked like an ordinary cell phone. "This is a secure communication device. It connects directly to Secret Service emergency response systems and includes GPS tracking for your safety." I stared at the device, trying to process that my wedding day was ending with me receiving federal security equipment. Is this permanent? "The heightened security measures are temporary," Agent Martinez explained. "Once Agent Harrison's transition from covert to acknowledged status is complete, most of these protocols will be relaxed. However, some basic security awareness will always be part of your life as a federal agent's spouse." Agent Thompson produced another set of documents. "Mrs. Harrison, these are confidentiality agreements regarding Agent Harrison's work assignments, operational details, and any classified information you may inadvertently encounter. Your signature indicates your understanding of the legal requirements surrounding your husband's position." As I signed documents that legally bound me to keep government secrets, I realized that this moment represented a fundamental transformation in my identity. I wasn't just Kennedy Harrison, the marketing professional who had married her college sweetheart. I was now Kennedy Harrison, spouse of a Secret Service agent, bound by federal confidentiality requirements and security protocols. "One more thing," Agent Thompson said, his tone becoming slightly more personal. "Mrs. Harrison, Agent Harrison has requested assignment to our Richmond field office to minimize travel and maintain a more stable home life. This is effective immediately following his return from honeymoon leave." I looked at James with surprise. "You requested a transfer?" "I requested assignment to domestic protection rather than presidential travel detail," he explained. "I want to be home with you more consistently, especially as we start our marriage and think about starting a family." This was the first indication I had received of how our relationship was going to influence James's career decisions. He was choosing assignments that prioritized our life together over the prestige and excitement of direct presidential protection. Agent Martinez handed me a final packet of materials. "Mrs. Harrison, this contains information about support services for Secret Service families, including counseling resources, social networks, and emergency protocols. Many agents' spouses find these resources helpful during the adjustment period." As we prepared to return to our wedding reception, Agent Thompson offered one final piece of guidance. "Mrs. Harrison, Agent Harrison, the transition from covert to acknowledged status can be challenging for couples. We recommend taking advantage of the counseling services and maintaining open communication about any concerns or difficulties you encounter." Walking back into the ballroom, I felt like I was entering not just my wedding reception, but my new life as a Secret Service agent's wife. The celebration continued around us with toasts, dancing, and all the traditional elements of a wedding reception, but I now understood that this party was also serving as my introduction to a community and lifestyle I had never imagined being part of.
My brother Michael approached us with a champagne flute in hand and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Kennedy, James, I have to ask, does this mean you've met the president?" James smiled with the kind of diplomatic discretion that I now realized he had been practicing throughout our entire relationship. "Michael, there are aspects of my work that I can't discuss, even with family, but I can tell you that serving in the Secret Service has been the greatest honor of my professional life." As the evening continued with cake cutting, bouquet tossing, and all the traditional wedding celebrations, I found myself observing our guests with new awareness. They were looking at James and me differently now, not just as newlyweds beginning their lives together, but as representatives of something larger and more significant than a simple love story. By the time we began our final dance of the evening, I had begun to understand that our wedding day hadn't just been about two people making a commitment to each other. It had been about my integration into a world of service, sacrifice, and dedication to protecting others that I was only beginning to comprehend. The woman who had woken up that morning expecting to marry a modest government analyst was ending the day as the wife of a federal agent, bound by security protocols and confidentiality agreements, carrying a secure communication device, and beginning to understand that her new marriage was going to be shaped by considerations she had never imagined.
But as James held me close during our last dance, I realized that despite everything that had changed about our circumstances, the fundamental reason I had fallen in love with him remained exactly the same. He was still the man who listened to my dreams, supported my ambitions, and made me feel like the most important person in his world. He just also happened to be someone whose job involved protecting the most powerful person in the free world. 6 months after our wedding, I stood in the kitchen of our new home in Richmond's Museum District, watching the morning news while preparing coffee for James before his shift at the Secret Service field office. The anchor was discussing increased security measures for an upcoming presidential visit to Virginia, and I found myself automatically noting details that would have meant nothing to me before I became a federal agent's wife. The house we had chosen together was a beautifully restored 1920s colonial that met both my aesthetic preferences and James's security requirements. It had clear sightlines, multiple exit routes, and a sophisticated alarm system that connected directly to federal emergency response networks. To visitors, it looked like the home of any successful young professional couple. To trained observers, it was clearly the residence of someone who understood threat assessment and protective protocols. James emerged from our bedroom already dressed in the dark suit that had become his uniform for domestic protection assignments. He looked exactly like the man I had married 6 months ago, but I now understood the significance of details I had previously overlooked. The way he automatically scanned our street before leaving the house. The reason he always positioned himself between me and strangers when we were out in public. The casual efficiency with which he could assess and respond to any situation that felt potentially threatening. "Senator Williams is visiting the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts today," he said, kissing my cheek and accepting the coffee I had prepared exactly the way he preferred. "I'll probably be home late, depending on how the event runs." This was how our conversations about his work functioned now. He could share general information about public assignments involving elected officials, but the details of presidential protection remained classified. I had learned to read between the lines of his schedule and understand when he was working routine domestic security versus the high-stakes assignments that required extended travel and complete communication silence. "I have a client presentation this afternoon," I told him, reviewing my own schedule on my tablet. The boutique chain that wants to expand their social media presence into influencer partnerships. My marketing business had flourished in ways I hadn't anticipated after our wedding. Word had spread through Richmond's social networks that Kennedy Harrison was not only an excellent marketing strategist, but also someone with unique insights into crisis communications and reputation management. The skills I was developing as a Secret Service spouse, discretion, strategic thinking, and grace under pressure, were proving unexpectedly valuable in my professional life. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. The first month of marriage had been an intense adjustment period as I learned to navigate the practical implications of being married to a federal agent. Simple activities like posting photos on social media required careful consideration. Social gatherings involved subtle security assessments. Even grocery shopping meant being aware of our surroundings in ways that had never occurred to me before. But the most significant change had been in my relationship with my mother.
Patricia Stewart had become James's most enthusiastic supporter, a complete reversal from her pre-wedding concerns about his career prospects. She now introduced him at social events as my son-in-law, the Secret Service agent, with obvious pride that bordered on boasting. Her friends at the country club hung on every carefully vague detail she was authorized to share about his work protecting government officials. Kennedy, my mother had said during our last lunch together, I owe you an apology for doubting your judgment about James. You clearly saw qualities in him that I was too focused on superficial concerns to recognize. This admission had meant more to me than any of the more dramatic revelations of our wedding day. My mother's respect for my decision-making had been restored, and our relationship had been strengthened by her recognition that I had chosen a partner of exceptional character and capability. My phone buzzed with a text from Madison, my former bridesmaid, who had become fascinated with the unique aspects of my marriage to a federal agent. Coffee later? I want to hear about the White House Christmas party invitation. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, an elegant card requesting the pleasure of Mr. and Mrs. Harrison's company at the White House holiday reception for Secret Service families. It represented official recognition of my status as a federal agent spouse and integration into a community I was still learning to navigate. James finished his coffee and gathered the equipment he carried for field assignments, communication devices, tactical gear, and other items I had learned not to ask about in detail. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the kitchen window that overlooked our backyard garden.
Kennedy, he said, his tone carrying the seriousness that usually meant he was about to share something significant, there's something we need to discuss when I get home tonight. My stomach tightened with the familiar anxiety that accompanied any unexpected serious conversation. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, he assured me quickly, but I've been offered an opportunity that would affect both of us, and I want your input before I make any decisions. After he left for work, I found myself wondering what kind of opportunity would require my input. James had been careful to maintain clear boundaries between his professional responsibilities and our personal life, seeking my opinion on career decisions that might affect our family while protecting me from classified information that could create security concerns. The morning passed quickly with client calls and project development for my growing marketing consultancy, but my attention kept drifting to James's mention of a significant opportunity and what it might mean for our still new marriage. Around noon, my secure communication device chimed with an encrypted message from James. Lunch at Belle Isle? Important conversation. Belle Isle was a small island park in the James River, where we often met for private conversations when James needed to discuss work-related matters away from our home and regular routines. The location provided natural security against electronic surveillance and allowed us to speak freely about topics that required additional discretion. I arrived at our usual spot near the pedestrian bridge to find James already waiting, his expression serious but not alarmed. He was still wearing his work suit, but he had loosened his tie and removed the earpiece that connected him to Secret Service communications during active assignments. Kennedy, he began, as I settled beside him on the park bench we had claimed as our own during the early months of our marriage, I've been offered an assignment to the Presidential Protection Division's advance team. I knew enough about Secret Service operations to understand the significance of this offer. Advance team assignments involve traveling ahead of presidential visits to assess security, coordinate with local law enforcement, and establish protective protocols. It was prestigious, important work that would significantly advance James's career within the agency. It was also work that would require extensive travel and long separations from home. What would that mean for us? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. It would mean I'm away from Richmond 3 weeks out of every month, James replied honestly. The advance team travels constantly, setting up security for presidential events across the country and internationally. It's an incredible professional experience, but it would be a significant change for our marriage. I studied his face, looking for clues about what he wanted to do versus what he thought he should do. James, is this something you want? He was quiet for a long moment, watching a family of ducks navigate the river current below us. 6 months ago, I would have said yes immediately. Presidential protection advance work is the career path that leads to the highest levels of Secret Service leadership. And now? Now I have to consider what it would mean to spend most of our first year of marriage traveling for work.
I have to think about whether career advancement is worth the sacrifice to our relationship. This was the kind of conversation I had never imagined having during our 18-month courtship, when I thought James's government work involved routine administrative responsibilities. Now I was being asked to weigh my husband's professional advancement against the stability of our marriage. How long would the assignment last? Minimum 2 years, James replied, possibly longer if I excelled in the role and wanted to continue advancing within presidential protection. I considered what 2 years of James being away 3 weeks per month would mean for our plans to start a family, for my own business development, for the foundation we were still building as a married couple. What happens if you decline the offer? I continue with domestic protection assignments based out of Richmond. Good work, important work, but not the fast track to senior leadership positions. James took my hand, intertwining our fingers in the gesture that had become our signal for serious conversations requiring complete honesty. Kennedy, I need you to know that whatever decision we make together, I will never regret choosing you over any career opportunity. Our marriage is the most important thing in my life. As I sat there overlooking the James River, holding hands with my husband while he asked me to help him choose between career advancement and our life together, I realized how completely my understanding of marriage had evolved since our wedding day. 6 months ago, I thought marriage meant supporting your spouse's career ambitions and adapting to whatever professional demands arose. Now I understood that marriage between equal partners meant making career decisions together, considering the impact of professional choices on both people's dreams and goals.
James, I said, squeezing his hand, I think we need to talk about what we both want our life together to look like 5 years from now, and then decide which opportunity gets us closer to that vision. The conversation that followed lasted over an hour and covered everything from our hopes for children to our dreams for travel, from my business expansion plans to his long-term career goals. It was the kind of comprehensive life planning discussion that our 18-month courtship had never quite achieved, partially because I hadn't known enough about his real work to fully understand the choices we would be facing. By the time we walked back to our cars, we had reached a decision that reflected both our individual ambitions and our commitment to building something extraordinary together. That evening, as we sat in our kitchen sharing takeout Chinese food and making lists of practical considerations related to James's career decision, I reflected on how much had changed since our dramatic wedding day revelation. The woman who had married a mysterious government analyst 6 months ago was now someone who could intelligently discuss federal security protocols, who carried encrypted communication devices, and who was helping her Secret Service agent husband make strategic career decisions that would affect both their professional futures. But more importantly, I was now someone who understood that the strongest marriages are built on complete honesty, shared decision-making, and the willingness to prioritize partnership over individual advancement when the stakes really matter. 2 years after our wedding, I stood in the East Room of the White House, wearing a navy blue cocktail dress and the pearl earrings my grandmother had given me, watching my husband receive the Secret Service's highest honor for exceptional service. The room was filled with government officials, fellow agents, and the families of men and women who had dedicated their lives to protecting others. James had decided to accept the Presidential Protection Division advance team assignment, and our marriage had not only survived the challenges of extensive travel and separation, but had thrived in ways that surprised both of us. The decision to prioritize his career advancement while building systems to maintain our connection had transformed us into partners who could navigate any challenge together. Agent James Alexander Harrison, the director of the Secret Service announced, is recognized for exceptional leadership during the coordination of presidential security for international summit meetings, demonstrating the highest standards of professional excellence and dedication to protecting our nation's leaders. As James stepped forward to receive his award, I felt a surge of pride that was completely different from anything I had experienced during our wedding day revelations. This wasn't a surprise or shock at discovering who he really was. This was deep satisfaction in watching someone I knew completely receive recognition for the extraordinary work he did every day. The past 2 years had taught me that being married to a Secret Service agent meant much more than adjusting to security protocols and confidentiality requirements.
It meant being part of a community dedicated to service, sacrifice, and protecting the democratic institutions that define our country. After the ceremony, we mingled with other Secret Service families in the White House State Dining Room. I had come to know many of these women over the past 2 years, spouses who had learned to navigate the unique challenges of being married to federal agents, mothers who had raised children within the protective but sometimes isolating world of government security. "Kennedy," said Maria Santos, whose husband had worked presidential protection for 8 years, "you and James have handled the transition from covert to acknowledged status better than any couple I've seen. What's your secret?" I considered her question while watching James across the room, engaged in animated conversation with colleagues who had become like family to us over the past 2 years. "I think the secret is that we never tried to pretend his job was just a job," I replied. "From the beginning, we treated his work as a calling that we were both committed to supporting, even when it meant sacrificing things we wanted for our personal life." This commitment had been tested repeatedly over the past 2 years. James had been away for our first wedding anniversary, providing advanced security for a presidential visit to Eastern Europe. I had spent last Christmas morning alone while he coordinated protection for the president's holiday travel. We had postponed starting a family until James completed his advance team assignment and transitioned to a role with more predictable scheduling. But these sacrifices had been made as conscious choices by equal partners who understood that James's dedication to protecting others was part of what made him the man I had fallen in love with. My marketing business had flourished during James's frequent travels, partly because his absences had forced me to develop independence and confidence that made me a more effective businesswoman. I now managed social media campaigns for clients across Virginia and had been invited to speak at marketing conferences about crisis communications and reputation management. The skills I had learned as a Secret Service spouse, discretion, strategic thinking, grace under pressure, had made me sought after by high-profile clients who needed marketing professionals who understood the importance of confidentiality and sophisticated public relations.
"Mrs. Harrison," a voice behind me said, and I turned to see Agent Thompson, who had managed our wedding day security operation 2 years ago and had since become something of a family friend. "Agent Thompson," I smiled, genuinely happy to see him. "How are you enjoying your new assignment?" He had recently been promoted to supervise training for new Secret Service agents, a role that allowed him to pass on the expertise he had developed during years of fieldwork. "I love it," he replied, "and I have to tell you, your wedding day has become something of a legendary story in our training programs." I looked at him with surprise. "What do you mean?" "We use it as a case study in how to manage the transition from covert to acknowledged status for agents who are starting families. The way you handled learning about James's real identity, the grace you showed during a very public revelation, your adaptation to the security requirements, it's become the gold standard for how these situations should be handled." I looked at him with surprise. "What do you mean?" "We use it as a case study in how to manage the transition from covert to acknowledged status for agents who are starting families. The way you handled learning about James's real identity, the grace you showed during a very public revelation, your adaptation to the security requirements, it's become the gold standard for how these situations should be handled." The idea that our wedding day drama had become a training example for other Secret Service couples was both amusing and oddly touching. I hope it's helpful for other families going through similar transitions. "It is," Agent Thompson assured me. "New agents and their spouses watch the video from your ceremony, with your permission of course, to understand how honesty, preparation, and strong communication can turn a potentially traumatic revelation into the foundation for a stronger relationship." James appeared at my side, slipping his arm around my waist with the natural affection that had remained constant throughout all the changes in our life together. "Agent Thompson was just telling me that our wedding has become famous in Secret Service training programs," I told him. James laughed, the same warm sound that had first attracted me to him in that coffee shop 3.5 years ago. "Famous for all the right reasons, I hope." "Absolutely," Agent Thompson replied. "Your situation demonstrates that when couples approach federal law enforcement careers as a team, they can build marriages that are stronger than traditional relationships because they're based on complete trust, shared sacrifice, and mutual respect for the importance of the work."
As the White House reception continued around us, I reflected on how completely my understanding of marriage, career, and service had evolved since our wedding day. The woman who had been shocked to discover her fiancé was a Secret Service agent had become someone who could navigate White House social events, manage the stress of her husband's dangerous work, and build a successful business partly based on skills learned as a federal agent's spouse. But the most significant change wasn't in my adaptation to James's career. It was in my understanding of what it meant to be part of something larger than ourselves. During James's advance team assignments, I had watched him coordinate security for events that preserved democratic processes and protected the leaders who make decisions affecting millions of people. I had seen the dedication, intelligence, and courage required to do that work effectively. I had come to understand that our marriage wasn't just about our personal happiness, it was about supporting someone whose work contributed to the safety and security of our entire country. This perspective has influenced every aspect of our life together. When James was away for extended assignments, I didn't just miss my husband, I was proud that he was doing work that mattered. When we had to decline social invitations because of his security responsibilities, I understood that we were making small sacrifices for important reasons. 6 months ago, James had transitioned from the advance team to a supervisory role in the Richmond field office, allowing him to be home more consistently while still advancing his career. We had started trying to have children, excited about raising a family within the Secret Service community that had become our extended family. As we prepared to leave the White House reception, I caught sight of ourselves in one of the ornate mirrors that lined the East Room. We looked like any other successful young couple attending a government function. James in his perfectly tailored suit, me in elegant professional attire, both of us comfortable navigating formal social situations. But I knew that we were something more than a typical professional couple. We were partners who had learned to balance personal dreams with service to something greater than ourselves. We were a team that had been tested by challenges most couples never face and had emerged stronger and more connected. The limousine ride back to our Richmond home gave us time to decompress from the formal ceremony and discuss the evening's significance. James, I said, settling against his shoulder in the familiar gesture that had comforted me through 2 years of adaptation and growth, do you ever regret how complicated our life together is compared to other couples? He was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same thoughtfulness he brought to all our serious conversations. Kennedy, do you remember what I told you at Belle Isle when I was deciding whether to accept the advance team assignment?
I nodded. You said our marriage was the most important thing in your life. That's still true, he replied, taking my hand in the gesture that had become our signal for complete honesty. But over the past 2 years, I've realized that what makes our marriage so important is that it's based on shared values about service, sacrifice, and contributing to something meaningful. He was right. Our relationship had been strengthened by the challenges that might have destroyed a couple with different priorities. The security requirements, the travel demands, the confidentiality restrictions, all of it has forced us to develop communication skills, trust, and mutual support that many couples never achieve. Any regrets about marrying a Secret Service agent? James asked with the slight smile that told me he already knew my answer. I thought about the woman who had walked down the cathedral aisle 2 years ago, expecting to marry a modest government analyst and live a quiet, predictable life. That woman had no idea that she was about to embark on an adventure that would challenge every assumption she had about marriage, career, and what it meant to be part of something significant. My only regret, I said, squeezing his hand, is that it took me 18 months to find out who I was really falling in love with. As our limousine pulled into the driveway of our Richmond home, I realized that the gift James had unknowingly given me on our wedding day wasn't just the revelation of his true identity. It was the opportunity to discover who I could become when I was challenged to grow beyond my expectations for myself. The marketing professional who had been focused on building a quiet, successful business had become someone who could thrive under pressure, navigate complex social situations, and build a career partly based on skills learned through extraordinary circumstances. The daughter who had been concerned about her mother's approval had become someone whose marriage had transformed her family's understanding of what constituted true success and worthiness.
The woman who had thought love meant finding someone who would never surprise or challenge her had learned that the strongest relationships are built on continuous discovery, mutual growth, and shared commitment to purposes greater than personal happiness. Our wedding day revelation had been the beginning of an ongoing transformation that continued to shape our marriage, our careers, and our understanding of what it meant to build a life together based on service, trust, and love that could withstand any challenge. As we walked into our home, past security systems that protected us and communication devices that connected us to a community of people dedicated to protecting others, I felt profound gratitude for the unexpected journey that had brought us to this moment. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as shocking revelations that force us to question everything we thought we knew about ourselves and the people we love. Sometimes the most meaningful relationships are built not on comfort and predictability, but on shared courage to face whatever challenges arise together. And sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that begin with the words, "There's something I need to tell you about who I really am." Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.